Now for a somber topic. It was a bad war, that Yom Kippur War. It cost Israel 3,000 dead, the largest number of casualties that dead casualties that Israel had experienced in any of its wars, with the exception of the war of 1948, when the Israelis lost 6,000 dead. So we are talking about a war, and a war, like all wars, really had enormous impact upon the belligerents and even people far beyond the Middle East. War is the midwife of change, and the Middle East changed a great deal as a consequence of the Yom Kippur War. For those of you that have heard me before, you know, especially I said this on Friday night. I quoted a French historian who said, "You cannot explain the present by the present. There's always a history of a particular event." So if the present for us is October 6th of 1973, then one has to look at the origins of that war. Now, I begin by telling you something that I think everyone should know, and I suspect that most of you do know. There can be no understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict unless you factor in 1948. For us, 1948 is a glorious year. For us, and particularly for Israelis, it is the war of liberation. A Jewish state, the first one in almost 2,000 years, was created. For the Arabs in particular, and Muslims in general, it is al-Nakba. It is the catastrophe. It is not only the fact that the Arabs were defeated, not only that probably around 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, it is also a stain on the honor of Islam as perceived by Muslims all over the world. After all, the Arabs outnumbered the Jews in terms of, I'll give you the population figures, in 1948. There were 650,000 Jews living in Palestine. There were over 1 million, probably 1,200,000 Arabs living in Palestine, and 40 million Arabs living in countries Arab countries surrounding Palestine. How could this be? How could it possibly be? In addition to that, there was, again, the religious factor as well. In the eyes of Islam, we are Dehimis. We are, together with the Christians, we are Dehimis. That literally means protected people. In the eyes of Islam, Judaism and Christianity are legitimate but inferior religions. It is fair to say, and one always has to be as fair as can be, that for hundreds of years you can make an accurate statement. It was far better to be a Jew living under Islam than it was to be a Jew living under the Christians. The Muslims historically were far more tolerant, certainly in the golden age of Islam. But even in that golden age, even in Moorish Spain, Jews had to know their place. We were not allowed to perform certain occupations, we could not bear weapons, and as any tour guide in Jerusalem worth his or her salt would tell you, that in the Islamic world, no synagogue could ever really be built larger than a mosque. We were unable to proselytize. Again, life was good for the most part. For the most part, there were pogroms, or the equivalent of pogroms in the Islamic world, but nothing like the slaughters that took place that our people experienced in the Christian world. So the question is, how can a Dehimi people, how could they possibly have beaten us? And finally, of course, as everybody should know, that Temple Mount, which is holy for us, is holy for them as well. To lose the Dome of the Rock, to lose El-Aqsa, to lose the Temple Mount, which the Islamic tradition says is from the mount that Muhammad ascended to heaven. To lose this to a Dehimi people is a disgrace, a stain on the honor of Islam. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that ever since 1948, there's always a longing for a second round. And there was a second round, and that was in 1956. That's the 96-hour war. And once again, the Arabs were defeated. And therefore, There's a look for a third round. And there was a third round. And the third round was in 1967, where in fact the most ignominious of the Arab defeats took place. There's nothing, here's a Berk's law, there's nothing like a humiliating loss in war to force a country to take a hard look, a very hard look, and ask the tough questions. Why did we lose? And what do we have to do to make sure that we're not going to lose again? What this means is, when it is all over, and when in 1971 the Prince of Darkness visits Nasser, and a new leader comes to power, Anwar Sadat, there's going to be a rethinking. To put it as succinctly as I can, the Egyptians, not the Israelis, will learn the lessons of the Six-Day War. Lenin used to say, he would be astonished, turning over in the mausoleum, to think that I'm quoting him before a Jewish audience. Not that Lenin was an anti-Semite. Stalin was, but Lenin was not. Lenin used to say, I even tell it to my students, one who has lost is worth 10 who have won. That is, if you lose, you suck it up, as we would say, you take the long, tough, and critical view of your own position, and you begin to prepare for the next round. The Egyptians prepared for the next round. They were humiliated. They had to recover at least some of what had been lost in the Six-Day War. So what do? They begin to look at the disparity. That is, what do the Israelis have and what do we have? The Israelis have always had, ever since 48, but not in 48, really domination of the air. That is, the Egyptians were going to have to find a way to neutralize that great Israeli Air Force. And they found a way. They received from their Soviet allies very sophisticated ground-to-air missiles. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Very successful. And the Egyptians did something that the Israelis did not do. Not only did they look at their experience in the Six-Day War, they looked at the American experience in the Vietnam War. And what they learned is that American air power was to a very large extent, at least fighter air power, ground support air power, was in fact neutralized by the ground-to-air missiles that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had, the same missiles that came from the Soviet Union that were now being placed in the hands of the Egyptians. In addition to that, the Israelis had something else. Israeli ground forces were superbly trained, and the Israeli advantage on the ground was that very, very fine tank force that the Israelis had. The Israelis had lots of tanks, and they had to be neutralized as well. And once again, the Egyptians learned from the Soviets, and indeed from the Vietnam experience, that there was an escalation in the efficacy of anti-tank weapons. It was no longer the realm of the bazooka. There were now anti-tank missiles that the Soviets had, and they were now transferred to the Egyptians. Another lesson that they learned was there is no substitution for large numbers of forces concentrated in a small area. When the attack comes, 600,000 Egyptian soldiers will participate in the attack. In 1973, that was more soldiers than the combined armies that NATO had on the European continent. So a concentration of large numbers of soldiers. Also, there had to be a steady resupply. Soviet ships set sail from Soviet ports before the war began, meaning that they would arrive when the war began and in the midst of the war, resupplying the Egyptian forces. That's very, very important as well. But the most significant and probably the most skillful thing that the Egyptians engaged in was a very, very sophisticated misinformation or disinformation campaign. Articles began to appear. They were placed. There were enough people in England and all over the world that was sympathetic to the Arab side, and some journalists were taken in. We began to read articles that the Egyptian army was in disarray, that the Egyptians had conflicts with the Soviets, that the Soviets, in fact, were pulling people out. The feeling or the impression that was conveyed that if war comes, it is not coming for a long period of time. Those who have studied the Yom Kippur War, again, this is the 40th anniversary, have said that perhaps the most important element in the preparation was this misinformation campaign, really, that was projected by the Egyptians. The Israelis were taken in. Now, let's look at the other side. What's happening on the Israeli side? One of the best commentators on the history of Israel, the book is dated now. The book was written at the end of the 1980s. It is the book by Conor Cruz O'Brien, the great Irish literary figure. It is a book I think is entitled The Siege. And what O'Brien said, O'Brien was a literary person, the bird of hubris flew from Baghdad and Amman and from Cairo and landed in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. In short, the Israelis were filled, at the very, very least, if one wants to be kind, with a great deal of overconfidence. The Israelis had whipped, really whipped, the Egyptians and the Syrians in the Six-Day War. They were overconfident to the point, and there may even have been a racist component in here, a belief that the Egyptians had neither the courage nor the skill to mount a successful attack. Also, the Israeli intelligence had told Golda Meir that war would come. The Egyptians would eventually make war, but the war would not come for some time. At the earliest, it would come in 1975, because the Israelis seemed to have swallowed a good deal of that misinformation, despite the fact that the Israelis had something that my country would have loved to have in dealing with Saddam Hussein and dealing with, of course, Iran at the present time. You can talk until you're blue in the face about technology, about spy satellites. There is nothing as good, any intelligence operative will tell you this, there is nothing as good as having one of your spies highly placed in the upper echelons of the enemy government. The United States did not have it with Saddam Hussein, and I'm not sure we have it in dealing with Iran. But the Israelis had it in Cairo. The Israelis had a spy that was highly placed. That spy was the son-in-law of Nasser, and he was on the payroll of the Mossad. And he was telling them, war is coming, and war is coming soon. The Israelis did not pay much attention to that. In addition to that, let me just say to you, for those of you that like historical analogies, the analogy is with the Soviet Union in the pre-June 22nd, 1941 period. June 22nd is the date of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin received intelligence. He had a spy. The greatest spy and the most important spy of the 20th century was Richard Sorge. He was a German communist who was sent on assignment to Tokyo, penetrated the German embassy with the Japanese Communist Party, and gave Stalin the information about the impending German attack. Stalin disregarded all of that information. So in Stalin's case, it's personality. In the Israeli case, it is hubris and overconfidence. The Israelis did not learn anything from the Vietnam War. The Israelis were convinced that they could, to use the expression, clean the Egyptian clock, and that was really a mistake. The two other things that the Egyptians did was to, again, coordinate with the Syrians, much greater coordination than was done in the Six-Day War, and also they prepared a weapon that if things went badly, well, they could be bailed out. The weapon was the oil embargo. There was a pre-existing agreement before the war that, in fact, the Arab states, particularly the Saudis, would really restrict the sale of oil to the United States and to American allies. The Israelis became aware only on the morning of October 6th, did Israeli intelligence finally confirm that war was going to come and war was imminent. In the preceding days, again as part of the misinformation campaign, Egyptian and Syrian forces moved to forward lines. The Israelis mobilized a little bit, and then the Egyptian and Syrian forces moved back. They did this 2 or 3 times. The Israeli response was, these are just feints. This is part of the misinformation. And since the Israeli army is largely a reserve army, that the Egyptians and the Syrians were really only doing this to weaken the Israeli economy. When a number of Israeli generals, David al-Azhar, for example, the chief of staff, argued that Israel should mobilize and mobilize lots of men, Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir probably said no. We know they said no. Don't, this will be provocative, and so on. And there is something else. There's so much to say about that pre-October 6th attack. What we do not know, but it may have taken place. Everybody knows the Israelis, before they go to war, really try and coordinate or get that proverbial green light from the United States. Levi Eshkol delayed and delayed in May and June of 67 until he got what he thought was at least a hint at a green light from Lyndon Johnson. Here's the controversy. Did Henry Kissinger, the American Secretary of State, did he somehow convince or convey to Anwar Sadat that if you want negotiations between you and the Israelis, and you want at least part of the Sinai back, then don't come to me. You got to bleed the Israelis. The Israelis will not make concessions unless they are forced to bleed, unless they bleed. Did Kissinger say that? Not in the words, this man is too sophisticated a diplomat, not to say it in the way I presented it. But there is some evidence, there are a number of commentators that say he gave, in one fashion or other, that proverbial green light. We do not know. We'll talk about Kissinger's role again and again in this particular lecture. The only thing, and here is where you got to know the culture, the only thing that the Egyptians did wrong, and it will prove very, very costly to them, they should have known better. They should have somehow paid a Jewish advisor to tell him that, or someone who knew Israel better. It is far better, if you are going to launch an attack upon Israel, launch the attack on Rosh Hashanah, not on Yom Kippur. Even secular Israelis show up in the synagogue on Yom Kippur. And if they don't show up in the synagogue, they stay at home. On Rosh Hashanah, in a country that is largely secular, for those of you that have been there, large numbers, by the hundreds of thousands, Israelis go to the beach. They go down to Eilat, they go to the beaches. The fact that the attack took place on Yom Kippur will make it, and this is of the greatest importance, it will make it much, much easier for the Israelis to mobilize that reserve army. That's an important point. The Egyptians got everything right except for that, and it will cost them dearly. The morning of October 6th, again, Israeli intelligence finally confirms that the attack is imminent. An intense discussion goes on between Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, David al-Azhar, and the Mossad. What do we do now? Elazar says, not only do we order a full mobilization, but most important of all, Israel has to launch a preemptive strike. That is, if we strike now, we can disrupt them, at the very least weaken their attack, and probably, maybe even, dissuade them from making an attack. Golda rejects this. So does Moshe Dayan. Again, the reason being, again, we're not altogether sure of this. Two things probably came into play. One, again, Israeli hubris. So we'll take the first hit. We'll take it, and then we'll smash them and go over to the offensive. And also, again, You must never forget this, and I say this not out of American chauvinism. Israel is always reluctant to move without the United States. And the input, the feeling that we have, the evidence that we have is that Secretary of State Kissinger is telling the Israelis, do not launch a preemptive strike. And again, from the Israeli perspective, you cannot antagonize the Americans. That, I must tell you, is a consistent element in Israeli foreign policy. Even Netanyahu understands this. You can't antagonize Washington, whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president. The nature of the dependency is so great, you can't tick off the United States. Is this what leads Golden not to launch the preemptive attack? Is it that Israeli hubris? Whatever it may be, there is no Israeli preemptive attack. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Egyptians and the Syrians attack. And the Egyptians demonstrate a flare. That is something that they had not demonstrated earlier. The Israelis had piled up huge mountains of sand right in front of the Bar Lev line, the Israeli defensive forces on the, let's say, the eastern side of the Suez Canal. The Egyptians had bought high-pressure and high-powered hoses. They shoot those hoses, the sand dissipates, the mountains of sand, and the Egyptian forces roll over. Perhaps the greatest example of Israeli hubris is that I told you that 600,000 Egyptian soldiers will participate in the attack. The total number of Israeli forces in the Bar Lev line was less than 800. In short, the Israelis think they can hold it off, probably thinking there will not be an attack in the first place, thinking that if there is an attack, they can hold off long enough in order to bring up the reserves. The Egyptians crash through. The Israelis are forced back. The Syrians mount an attack on the Golan Heights and, in fact, penetrate very, very deeply. Haifa is in danger. For the first time in a long time, in a confrontation with the Arab states, an Israeli city, a large Israeli city, is in trouble. Now, to cut to the chase, without getting into great detail in the war, the fact that Israel survives all of this is primarily a consequence of the pluck, the courage, and the skill of Israeli soldiers. That is, mistakes are made. That is, as the Egyptians cross the canal, the Israelis will hit them. The counteroffensive will be frittered away before massive reserves are brought up. That is a mistake. What you do, at least in retrospect, you take the hit, you withdraw to a position from which you can easily defend, and you wait for the reserves to pull in. But the Israelis did not do that. They sent attacks prematurely, and those attacks would again be repulsed by the Egyptians. But there is no question, those Israeli soldiers in the Sinai, wherever the mistakes were made by the high command, they will show a great deal of pluck and a great deal of courage. Also, on the Golan Heights, Haifa is in danger. But again, 180 Israeli tanks will fight the Assyrians to a standstill, again withdrawing, but fighting them to a standstill, giving Israel precious time to mobilize the reserves. In addition to that, there were some skilled actions taken by Israeli commanders, the most skillful of them all, Ariel Sharon, who was able to eventually cross the canal. And then the two other facts of life. What does our Torah say? Achrei mot kedushin, right? After death, holiness. When a man dies or a woman dies, they turn into saints. You never went to a funeral where the rabbi gets up and says, let's talk tachlis, he was a son of a bitch. You never hear that. You never hear that. So I only mention this to you because after King Hussein died, he became a saint. Now, King Hussein, among Arab leaders, was the best of a bad lot. But King Hussein made two great mistakes, really, that cost his country and cost him very, very dearly, and cost the Palestinians very, very dearly. Mistake number one is he entered the Six-Day War. He should not have entered. He swallowed Nasser's misinformation. And the consequence of that is he lost Jerusalem and he lost the West Bank. He should not have entered the Six-Day War. His second mistake was, in the Yom Kippur War, he does not enter the war. That's a time when Israel is reeling. Had he used his relatively well-trained and well-equipped Jordanian army against the Israelis, he would have put Israel in great danger and would probably have recovered something of what he had lost in the Six-Day War. But by staying out of the war, he frees up Israeli forces on the Jordanian front. That's going to help Israel as well. And then, and here is where you see human nature and realpolitik play a very, very interesting role. No one in the United States would ever accuse Richard Nixon of being a man that liked Jews. Whether he was an anti-Semite or not, in an American context, yeah, you could say he's a mild anti-Semite. The tapes reveal him talking about how the Jews are always liberals, the Jews are always out to get him, and so on. But this man was a shrewd, we would say, a shrewd cookie. This man understood realpolitik. And so as Israel reeled back and ran out of crucial weapons, Richard Nixon, the evidence would indicate, not Schlesinger, not Kissinger, not Weinberger, not any of them, that the real issue here was, it was Richard Nixon. It is Richard Nixon that okayed the massive resupply of weapons and ammunition to Israel in the middle of October. It was not done as a consequence of a burst of philo-Semitism. The evidence is very clear on this. But Nixon understood, again, some basic facts of life. He is reputed to have told a reporter after the war, "Why did you resupply the Israelis?" And Nixon is supposed to have said, it was a very simple decision. Their guys were beating our guys. That is, the protégés of the Soviet Union, the Egyptians and the Syrians, were beating a country that was long linked with the United States. If the United States let Israel go down, then what would be worth? How much would it be worth? The alliance system that the United States had constructed with a whole host of countries. The prestige of the United States was on the line here. Not out of any love for the Israelis, but it was on the line for the United States if Israel went down the tubes. So the resupply takes place. And there's an interesting aspect to that resupply, which again will have an impact upon Israeli thinking. I told you that the Israelis always have to think about the United States. They will think even more about the United States. One, because of the resupply, and then because of an unfortunate fact of life. When the United States wanted those planes resupplying the Israelis to land at European bases, not one NATO country agreed to allow American planes resupplying the Israelis to land at air bases. It is only as a result of great pressure that the small and relatively weak country of Portugal allowed American planes to refuel in the Azores, and from there they went on to Israel. For Israelis, the sense of isolation was absolutely complete. And so, therefore, again, the resupply comes in, the Israelis show pluck, show a great deal of skill, good commanders, a great deal of courage. The war turns. The Syrians are not only held, they are thrown back. And because of Sharon and because of other Israeli commanders, and above all the courage and the skill of Israeli soldiers, the greatest tank battle since the Second World War takes place. The Israelis clean the Egyptian clock. Sharon, in the middle of October, crosses over the canal and surrounds the large Third Egyptian Army. Enter into this Henry Kissinger. Kissinger delivers an ultimatum to the Israelis. Don't strangle the Third Egyptian Army and don't move on to Cairo. And when the Israelis, let us say, oppose what he is saying, when they say, listen, we took the hit, we've suffered large casualties, don't cheat us out of a total military victory. Kissinger's response is, if you don't relax the stranglehold and allow the Egyptians to resupply their army, I will send in American helicopters that will resupply the Third Egyptian Army, and you will be in the dubious position of, if you want to refuse them, you'll have to shoot down American planes and American helicopters. The fact of the matter is, no Israeli government is going to do that. And there's something else that had to be said. I, like many of you, and the overwhelming majority of Israelis, were absolutely convinced at the time Kissinger had stabbed Israel in the back and deprived Israel of the victory that it deserved. But at least in retrospect, one can say, and it's hard for me to say it, Henry Kissinger was right. He was right because a complete or total defeat for the Egyptians would have made it impossible for Anwar Sadat to go to Jerusalem 4 years later. An Egyptian government, smarting under another humiliating defeat, would never have begun to initiate peace negotiations with the Israelis. It is as simple as that. Kissinger understood this. And remember, I'm telling you now what I tell my students ad nauseum in class, and that is, what is important in history is not reality. What is important in history is perception. Perception is reality. If you go to Cairo today and you talk to Egyptians, the Yom Kippur War, first of all, is called the War of Ramadan, and second, the Egyptians perceive it as a great Egyptian victory. And Anwar Sadat was hailed in Egypt as the hero of the crossing. And if you go to Cairo today, you go on a tour, depending if it's a young tour guide, a chauvinistic Egyptian, he will take you to a museum that commemorates the 1973 war, and in that museum you will see captured Israeli tanks, captured Israeli equipment, and all sorts of discussions about how the Egyptians defeated the Israelis. Perception is reality. It means that the war is going to shape the peace settlement and, of course, the years to come. Let's deal on the Egyptian side. What does it mean? It means that Anwar Sadat now has the proper yichus. I had the guts to attack the Israelis, and I inflicted massive casualties upon them. We have restored the honor that was lost in 1967 and partial honor of what was lost in 1948. We inflicted 3,000 dead. We rocked Israel to its very core. In addition to that, there are other things that Anwar Sadat is going to learn. One is a more sober assessment. We hit the Israelis with everything we had. We had the element of surprise, and in the end, whatever is said publicly, the Israelis turned the tide. Any dream of liquidating or eliminating Israel from the face of the earth, it's not going to take place. And a third consequence on Sadat's part is, yeah, the Soviet equipment was good, but the major player on this planet, the one without which there can be no agreement, the one which can help us bail out our sick economy, there's only one country that can do that, and that is the United States. And the road to Washington, D.C. runs through Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. That is, if you want American assistance, if we want American economic assistance, we must engage in negotiations with the Israelis. That's why Anwar Sadat is going to initiate those secret negotiations with the Israelis. On the Israeli side, the consequences are also going to be consequential and very, very sobering. 3,000 Israeli dead. To put that in a context, again, the population of the United States at that time was approximately 200 million. That is about 35 to 40 times the population of Israel. So what would it mean for the United States? The equivalent of losing, let's say, about 120,000 men. The total number of Americans lost in 12 years of fighting in Vietnam was less than 60,000. In 3 weeks' time, the Israelis lost the equivalent of 120,000 American soldiers. A sobering thing for any Israeli diplomat, prime minister, politician, or for the overwhelming majority of Israeli citizens. We have been bled, and we have been bled badly. Maybe now it is time to look for a negotiated settlement, at least with the Egyptians. The second thing, of course, is when it's all over, the Israelis, who are accustomed to lightning victories, after all, 6 days in 67, 96 hours in 56, smashing victories for the Israeli armed forces, it's not that way in 1973. So the Israelis set up a special commission. That's the Agranat Commission, to look into what happened. And when the Agranat Commission looked in, they are come to a number of conclusions. The Israeli army was ill-prepared. They should have had enough equipment. They didn't even have eating utensils, enough eating utensils for its soldiers. We were ill-equipped, the Agranat Commission says. That was a serious mistake. There was a breakdown in intelligence. We've got to improve our intelligence. And to use what is now a current American expression, the Agranat Commission came to the conclusion there is no substitute for boots on the ground. You gotta have large numbers of soldiers, more than the 500 that stood at the Bar-Lev line. I must tell you, not all of the Bar-Lev line was taken, but most of it was taken, and of course the Egyptians passed it by. There's got to be better better coordination between Israeli air power and those forces on the ground. It wasn't as good as it should have been. And perhaps most significant of all, remember, you lose, you look a little bit more critically than before. The Israelis now began to understand that they had better develop what is called avionics. There's got to be a better way that Israeli aircraft can avoid those ground-to-air missiles. 20% of the Israeli Air Force was shot down in the first 48 hours of the war. We've got to do a better job, and that eventually will be done. Just to jump ahead. The lesson will be learned because in 1982, in Operation Peace for the Galilee, the Israelis in a half hour will destroy the ground-to-air installations in the Bekaa Valley and shoot the Assyrian Air Force out of the sky and not lose any Israeli planes. The Israelis had learned the lesson of the Yom Kippur War. On a political front, of course, somebody's got to pay a price. Golda Meir will pay that price. And I think it's a justifiable price. She did not prepare the country well for the war. She did not make the great decisions. Two Israeli politicians were far more popular outside of Israel than they were in Israel. I cannot speak for your country. In my country, everybody loved Abba Eban. Abba Eban was not so popular in Israel. And everybody, especially women, loved Golda. Everybody loved Golda. But in that crunch, Golda may not have acted in the correct way. She will be punished. And so, too, will be punished, will be the Labor Party. That is the moderate socialist party that had governed Israel ever since 1948. You cannot conceive of what happened in the 1977 elections unless you see it against the backdrop of the Yom Kippur War. The ultimate outsider, Menachem Begin, now becomes the Prime Minister of Israel. A very, very interesting piece of work. Menachem Begin, the man from the Irgun, the man considered not only by the British, but by most Israelis to be a terrorist, this is the man that now comes and becomes the Prime Minister of Israel. And this is very important. Why does he become the Prime Minister of Israel? Again, most significant because of those experiences in the Yom Kippur War, but also of something else. We all knew it when we went to Israel. We all knew that it was there. But when we went to Israel, I speak of most of us, myself, most American Jews, most Canadian Jews, we didn't have much contact with those Israelis. We had contact with Israelis like ourselves, people who came from Europe, Ashkenazic Jews, right? We usually had contact, middle-class Ashkenazic Jews. Some of them even spoke Yiddish. Many of them spoke Yiddish. Many of them were Holocaust survivors. But there was always a second Israel. The second Israel came from Yemen. The second Israel came from Iraq, came from Libya, came from Syria, came from Morocco, that second Israel. We never had contact with them, but they were growing in numbers. And they got nothing, as they perceived it, from the labor governments. Now they vote as they had voted before. So the combination, they voted for the Likud. And so what's going to happen? The combination of the votes of the second Israel, which began to outnumber Ashkenazic Jews in the country, together with the experiences of the Yom Kippur War, propel Menachem Begin into power. That's very, very important. For Begin looks at the world differently than Labor did. Just to give you an idea, I had the good fortune in 1978, on one of my trips to Israel, to meet with 11 other academicians, to meet with Golda Meir. We had lunch with Golda. Two things I will tell you. One, I have never met, man or woman, anybody as tough as Golda. I mean, this woman was tough. And the second thing is, I never met anybody that chain smoked as much. We were there for 2 or 3 hours. She must have gone through 3 packs of cigarettes. But what is most interesting and most important is she excoriated Begin. She excoriated him for agreeing to, let us say, make concessions in Egypt. For her, the crucial issue was the West Bank. For her, you hold on to Egypt. That was her experience in the 56 war. We conquered the Sinai, you got to hold on to it. That's where the attack came from on Yom Kippur. That's where the attack is going to come again. Make concessions on the West Bank. Give the Palestinians, if not a state, turn it over to Jordan. Give it to them. But hold on to the Sinai. It became clear to me, and I think every other academician that was there, that if Golda Meir was the Prime Minister of Israel in 1977, there would never have been the Camp David Accords. Begin, on the other hand, of course, believes that that's part of Israel, Judea and Samaria. What in English is called the West Bank, that's ours. This is the old Jabotinsky man speaking. That's our land, and you don't give it back. But when it came to Egypt and the Sinai, that was a different story. So what does Begin do? He's got to make the tough call. Here is what I think goes through his mind. Sadat has told him, you want peace? Sadat has told the Knesset, you want peace with Egypt? You got to give us back every inch of the Sinai, every single inch of the Sinai, including your beautiful settlement of Yamit. And you've got to give us back Sharm el-Sheikh. You got to give it all back to us. Begin, before the election, had come close to swearing on a pack of Bibles, we'll never give them back Sharm el-Sheikh. We'll never give them back El Arish. And certainly we will not give them back Yamit. He gives it all back. And he gives it back because I think he reasoned as follows. If I hold on to the Sinai, I have strategic depth, I have the oil of the Sinai, and I have Yamit. That's what I have if I hold on to the Sinai. But if I hold on to the Sinai, I will never have peace with Egypt. Do you understand what I'm saying? If I give it up, there's a chance for peace with Egypt. And what Begin does is, to use the colloquial expression, he bites the bullet. He agrees to give it up. And he gets that peace with Egypt. And Begin, who had a very good way with words, Begin came to the United States and laid it out to an American Jewish community that was very skeptical of his making concessions, giving back the Sinai. And he put it this way: only a man that had a great sense of Jewish history, like Begin had, could put it. He said to an American audience and to an Israeli audience, this isn't peace between Egypt and Israel. This is peace between Mitzrayim and Eretz Yisrael. The Hebrew word Mitzrayim for Egypt connotes a long-standing hostility and tension and war going on for eons, for millennia, between Egypt and Israel. We have made peace with the greatest and the most traditional of our enemies. Now, he doesn't use what I'm about to say, but the thrust of it is, that's not chopped liver. That is a significant event. And so, it has enormous consequences for what is going to come. Whatever the difficulties Israel has had with Egypt, if you shoot back at me, it is the coldest of pieces. And that is absolutely correct. That is, the Egyptian people are filled with animosity towards the Israelis. Probably large numbers of Egyptians want to scrap the Camp David Accords. But the fact of the matter is, whatever has happened since 1977, 78, and 79, despite Operation Peace for the Galilee in 1982, despite the attack upon Iraq, upon the Osiris reactor in 1981, it doesn't make any difference. The peace has held, despite going into Gaza, despite fighting 2 wars in Lebanon. The peace has held, and that is a significant event. And then something else that pertains to my country, and that is the oil embargo really hit America very, very hard. And I can tell you, many American Jews were frightened. What are they going to say? And in fact, there were signs. Gas the Jews. We want gas, gas the Jews. The Jews brought about the embargo. But those were solitary voices. In the end, America, or the people of the United States, did not turn against Israel, did not turn against the American Jewish community. There was no dramatic eruption of anti-Semitism in the United States. That would give great confidence to the American Jewish community to deal with the future. So, in short, the war changed a lot. Unfortunately, all Israelis think that the war that they fight is always going to be the last war. Unfortunately, it was not the last war. I'm not preaching gloom and doom, but who knows when the next war is going to come. But as Trotsky said in a famous statement, war is the locomotive of history. War changes everything. War changed the Middle East that you and I now deal with in the year 2013. Thank you very much.